I want to thank Ferdinando and Paolo and everybody who's gone to much trouble to create such a wonderful conference. When I was a kid, our grandparents would take us to the cemeteries as a way of honoring our dead. And being a little kid, of course, we would have meals out there, picnics and things. And being a little kid, we had a tendency to run around. And of course, our aunts, mostly our aunts, but our uncles, would yell at us and tell us, "Be careful, you're stepping on the dead." I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal people who we're standing on today. Once upon a time, I was with a group of Native Americans in Chicago, and I told them that story about the cemeteries. And they said, "Everywhere you stand, you're standing on our dead." And it just put whatever my little experience was into this little shell, and I just swallowed it. So. Between 1920 and 1950, the number of Italians immigrating to the United States diminished each year. No longer were Italians leaving their homeland by the thousands. Two reasons are usually given for this. During this period, living conditions in Italy had greatly improved, and the American government had placed limits on the numbers of people who could immigrate to America from any one country, especially the South. However, the end of World War II brought a new wave of Italian immigration, and these immigrants would change the definition of what we thought was an Italian American. For the children and the grandchildren of the first major wave of Italian immigration to the United States, these new arrivals came as the enemy we had defeated, the people we had liberated. They came as our people, and most Italian Americans wanted nothing to do with them. But no matter what they wanted, their arrival would forever change the identity of the Italian in the United States. In my experience, I saw my family as finally becoming Americans when the Fazzola family, and I used to use the real name of this family, and then one of the real family members came up to me and said, "Stop using our name." And I said, "Why?" He says, "Because it's not your name. It's not yours to use." So this idea of not speaking about yourself in public came very strongly. Anyway, we'll call them the Fazzola family. They moved in next door. They were the new Italians, and even though our lives were separated only by a picket fence and a small garden that the previous owners had neglected for years, we were worlds apart. Until they moved in, whether or not we wanted it to be, we were America's Italians. In spite of the fact that our speech was only seasoned with the Italian that was the only language of our grandparents, which really was the dialect of Puglia. In spite of the fact that hamburgers and hot dogs had long replaced lunches of pasta fagioli, scroll, and beans, and in spite of the fact that the red, white, and blue had become our new tricolore, we were still the Italians. If only because others saw us as having different names, noses, or skin color. But all this changed the day the Fazzola family moved next door. It was early spring when their moving van pulled up outside our home. I was out front, bouncing a rubber ball against the front stoop steps, pretending not to notice them. I continued playing while the family ferried boxes and furniture from the street onto their front porch. My mother yelled to me to lend them a hand, and I pretended not to hear her. She came out of our house, grabbed me by the arm, and dragged me over to where their front steps were and where they had gathered to take a break. When my mother tried to speak to them in English, they could barely respond. So Mr. Fazzola asked if she spoke Italian. She tried, but she spoke a dialect that hadn't changed in over 30 years. One peppered with Italian-American words like bascimento that made them snicker and scratch their heads. When the new immigrants heard her speak what she thought was good Italian, they laughed, and as though in some form of retaliation, I decided it was okay to laugh and mock their broken English. I helped them only because my mother had forced me to. But throughout the whole ordeal, not a word passed between us. These were the Italians who immigrated to America during the 1950s. We called them immigrants with wings. For they had come to America in airplanes, unlike my grandparents, who had crossed the Atlantic in overcrowded boats. These people came with a truckload of possessions, not like my grandparents, who were lucky if they could carry along a cardboard suitcase or a burlap sack stuffed with what they had to bring. You would have thought that there would have been a natural affinity between these two groups of immigrants, but nothing could have been more different. They came better educated and with a greater knowledge of America than had their turn-of-the-century predecessors. They had been prepared by years of association with American soldiers and the subsequent media invasion of their culture. They arrived more like Americans, yet they remained quite different. To us, they were the new greaseballs, and we wouldn't let them forget it. It took a few years for the Fazzolos to become more like us, but in the process, we started becoming more like them. Mrs. Fazzolo would send over samples of her homemade cooking. My grandfather worked with Mr. Fazzolo to triple his yearly production of wine. My grandmother joined Mrs. Fazzolo in their backyard for the drying of tomatoes into paste. They rejuvenated my grandparents' Italian and kept the sound alive so that later, when I finally decided to study my ancestral language, my pronunciation was closer to theirs than it was to my grandparents. Years later, after I had learned Italian, I went back to my old neighborhood and spoke for the first time at length with the people next door in what I came to call our language. I learned that Mr. Fazzolo had been a partigiano during the war and had spent 3 years in a fascist prison until he was freed by Allied soldiers. He told me of having witnessed the machine gunning of innocent people by the Nazis. He told me of how his father had been shot by a firing squad. He told me of how his whole family had been driven out of their village for fear of their lives. And all that he told me made me ashamed of how we had first treated them when they had first moved into the house next door. Essentially, their immigration had created two types of Italian Americans. They maintained contact with Italy, and every few years took trips back. But as the years passed and the trips grew fewer and farther between, the people next door eventually grew to be different from contemporary Italians, so that if for some reason a new immigration to America had begun, and now we have one, our next door neighbors would be viewed by the new immigrants as American. This whole experience forced me to question just what it was that the experience of immigration to America could do to a human being. In our efforts to preserve Italian-American culture, are we just preserving a memory that is frozen in time? For the people next door had a different memory of Italy than had my grandparents, than even I had had since I traveled back. It made me realize that with each wave of immigration, the image of Italy changes, just as the experience of being American changes. In their own peculiar way, the people next door brought me closer to my Italian heritage, but only after I realized that my idea of being American was falsely rooted in trying to distance myself from them. For I thought, and wrongly so, that the only way for me to be an American was to alienate the people next door. Now, Italian Americans are as different from Italians as the egg is different from the eggplant. There's a familiar word connected to each, but they are two very different things. There are as many different definitions of Italian Americans as there are Italian Americans, and the same goes for Italians. And this is the hardest thing to get through to anybody who belongs to an Italian American organization, is that there could be more than one type of Italian American. We have a tendency, when we use the word Italian American, to refer to a specific segment of Italian America, the children and grandchildren of those who immigrated from southern Italy during the turn of the century. And even though most of today's Italian Americans can indeed trace their past to this period of immigration, we cannot forget that there were political refugees during the 1850s from northern Italy, and that after World War II there was an entirely new wave of immigrants whose experiences were completely different from the earlier immigrants, ones I call the people next door. And so when we use the word Italian American, we cannot claim to be all-inclusive. Examples of how these different identities have been and continue to be created and how they change can be found in the art created by Italian Americans. For any Italian American who has examined his or her physical and mental state, it is no surprise that there is indeed a great deal of difference visible when we begin comparing generations who come from these different eras of immigration. Yet some things do move through generations unchanged, and we tend to refer to these characteristics as our heritage. However, beyond the packaged products, costumes, and food, heritage is composed of processes, ways of being, ways of behaving. Typically, those products and processes move from generation to generation by way of elders, both in their words and action. I still can't stand to see food wasted, and have often avoided ordering a full meal in a restaurant when I used to have my children. This is something I learned from my parents and my grandparents. It is often looked upon as crude behavior, but the scarpetta, using a bit of bread to gather up the sauces or gravies on my plate, was something expected by my family, but frowned upon the first time I ate dinner in a non-Italian home. Yeah. What are you doing with that bread? My sister is really the true keeper of this tradition in our family. She can turn a fried chicken leg into a piece of bony pipe. This waste not, want not attitude is one of the physical products of our heritage. In terms of processes, the stories of our past, especially when told by our elders, has been the major vehicle by which our heritage is transmitted from one generation to the next. But this process became endangered when Italians migrated to the U.S. Loss of shared primary languages, lack of shared environments as children leave not only the homes, but the neighborhoods and often the states of their upbringing, contribute to the distorted transmission of a heritage. This unconscious is rarely addressed in the gangster films of our talented film and video directors because they're more likely to be interested in making money as opposed to trying to tell the story of an Italian-American psyche. Education is about the interplay between the known and the unknown. And we have a tendency to focus just on what is known. We want to educate people to what is known. There is a tension created between the conscious and the unconscious of the Italian-American people. By conscious, I mean the ways we identify ourselves as Italian-Americans and the ways we express that identity. By unconscious, I mean the psychic elements that haunt us in our private thoughts, that come to us in dreams that we cannot tell anyone about, those thoughts and feelings that we cannot understand unless we engage in some type of dialogue, perhaps counseling. I'm generalizing to make a point, not to point a finger, so please bear with me. As Italian Americans have moved up the economic ladder of success, they do so at the risk of losing their very identity as Italian Americans. At the end of a section of her novel, Umbertina, Helen Berolini has the matriarch of a family sitting by herself near a tree during a family reunion picnic. She looks around and is proud of what she and her husband had created out of the nothing that they brought with them to America. But then there is a sadness that overcomes her to the point of tears. And that is when she comes to realize that of all the relatives here, there is not one to whom she can tell her story. Not one of her daughters or sons or granddaughters or grandsons can, nor will they ever know her story. Quote, she had won, but who could she tell her story to? At times, the doubt came to her whether she had really won, after all. All her life had been a struggle for family, and now, in her old age, she saw some signs that made her uneasy. It is not long before this uneasiness that we find in Berolini's novel becomes a dis-ease of sorts. And many of you know that this is not simply the stuff of novels. This occurs in every family in which the experience of one generation is denied entry into the consciousness of the next. More often than not, this occurred when the language of the immigrants is not passed on to the children. Remember, the immigrants' experiences were processed in Italian, or their versions of Italian, dialects. And were they not recorded, not passed on from one generation to the next, it's most likely due to the impossibility of communicating such complex thoughts and feelings in a new language. By the time I learned to speak, read, and write Italian, my grandparents were dead, and my parents had stopped speaking the language. What was lost, only I could imagine. So I went in search of those stories. What I found that was while they couldn't control how they passed down a heritage through conscious stories, they were passing down some very unconscious elements that we must understand before we can succeed as a culture. One of those elements is the idea of captivity, and the keynote this morning really brought it into play. And I wish I had this picture of my mother sitting on a picnic table with a radio between her legs, because it does exactly to, in an American way, what the Fiki di India did to Joe's mother. Whatever Italy is to you, whatever it has become since World War II, its people have yet to deal with the impact on the individual psyche caused by centuries of rule by invaders. Italians' notions of figura, of sprezzatura, of putting on a front, of not letting people know what you really think and feel, is a result of living amidst the enemy. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to realize that to live this life requires the construction of two or more selves. This is nothing particularly Italian. It is something that happens whenever a person is held in captivity or slavery. And if you create two or more of yourselves, how do you remember which one told a lie and which one told the truth? I'll give you an example. My mother, when they invented decaf coffee, my mother was a consummate host. Her guests got whatever they wanted. If we didn't have it, she'd say, "Freddie, run down to the store and get this." Well, she didn't believe that there really was this thing called decaf coffee. So she made 2 pots. She made the big pot of egg coffee, and then she thought, I'll leave the eggs out of the little pot. So people who wanted coffee would get either the egg coffee, and someone said, "Do you have decaf?" And she said, "Sure." And asked me to pour it. I said, "Ma, this isn't decaf." She, "Shh." So she poured it. "Here you go." Everybody's happy. I said, "Ma, what's going to happen when they leave and they can't go to sleep?" She goes, "When they're in their house, that's their problem. In my house, everybody gets what they want." And it's incredibly funny to think that, but it could lead to some very dangerous scenarios, especially if you're, lactose intolerant or something. But the idea is this. The idea is that the psychic defense of splitting the self that serves from the self that rebels is something that we have inherited, whether we understand it or not. Some have referred to this as immigrant fear. I was talking once with a poet, Diane Prima. She goes, "Oh, I know what you're talking about. I call it immigrant fear." But I think it goes long back before immigration. This feeling of being two selves has translated into a sense of being Italian and American. And it is a feeling that has been rarely recognized and is only recently being dealt with in the mental health studies and practices. However, it has always been there in our stories. We need to understand more and more how the psychic defense of splitting has resulted in the punishment and reward systems used in our families. We need to understand how the splitting impacts our lives today when we no longer live in physical captivity, but maintain the psychic defenses to it and continue to use it. I would say that we're in psychic captivity. It is a part of what Freud has called our emotional heritage. This is what I mean when I talk about understanding the Italian American unconscious. And a good place to start with is our stories, where we'll find there is an identical difference between the Italian and the Italian American. Thank you.
Wow.